All right, we are live. Welcome in latest episode of that SEC podcast. I'm your host, Michael Bratton. I go by SEC Mike on Twitter. And I'm joined by Steven Lassan, senior editor over at Athlon Sports. He goes by Athlon Steven on Twitter. What's up, Steven?
Hey, Mike, it's good to talk to you. SEC After Dark. It's always my favorite time of the week. It's February, but it's doesn't feel like the off season. I was working on some stuff for the Athlon Sports magazine earlier today, and then we get this little interesting tidbit about playoff expansion when we haven't had a game yet. So, man, I'm fired up because spring practice is here for the SEC. So, looking forward to it.
Right, and spring's here. I'm seeing it in the comments already, Steven. Where's Cousin Shane? Cousin Shane's still drunk on the beach. I even asked, I was like, hey, any chance you can make a cameo here? He said, I'm way too hungover to do something like that. So we got Steven, and whenever we got Steven on, it's a little bit more informational, analytical, whatever you want to call it. So Steven and we're going to talk about the biggest storylines, concerns, questions, whatever you want to call it, for every SEC team, as opposed if it was just Shane and it would be me and Shane being agreeable or disagreeable. At least you're bringing something to the table in terms of research for this episode.
Are you sure that Cousin Shane's not interviewing to be like an analyst on Nick Saban, or I guess on Kalen DeBoer's? Yeah, I was caught myself on Kalen DeBoer's staff, or is he testing the NCAA football game under classified like Area 51 type deal down there, maybe in Orlando? I think that's where EA is now.
He is in that state. I will tell you that. So there, you might be onto something, Steven. I mean, once that game comes out, I'm afraid he may never do this show again, or any show for that matter.
Or he's maybe like the 300th person added to Billy Napier's front office down there in Gainesville this offseason.
All right, Steven. So, hey, we got a lot of teams to hit on, and we like to go in alphabetical usually on here. So let's just start with Alabama. A lot of different concerns, question marks, whatever you want to call it, with Kalen DeBoer replacing Nick Saban. So what's kind of maybe the first one on top of your mind here when it comes to Alabama here entering their first spring under Kalen DeBoer?
I have a big picture thought on Alabama, and that is I want to see the current returning roster. How does it mesh with the new coaching staff? Alabama's got 10 returning starters this season, and you sort of go up and down the depth chart. There are question marks kind of on both sides of the ball. Rebuild offensive line. Who's going to be the main pass catchers this year? How does Jalen Milroe look in this system? Defensively, I thought it was interesting to hear that Nick Saban is kind of teaching Kane Womack the defense. They're going to try and mesh those his scheme from South Alabama and what Alabama was doing last year to some extent. So I think you have a roster that is ultra talented. The expectations are sky high. I'm just interested to see how this all meshes together. This spring is kind of our first look at it. So that's what I'm looking for, is just the meshing of all these new things together.
Yeah. And, so I went there very similar to you, Stephen. Was just biggest thing is how these players acclimate to Kalen DeBoer and what he's got. And one thing you didn't mention, but I'm sure, we're all naturally, I don't know if this is good for the sport or not, Stephen, but we're eyeing the upcoming transfer portal already, which comes at the conclusion of spring. So in a roundabout way, I'll be interested. And we know Alabama's going to add some guys, I would assume. But I'll be curious to see if any players leave, Stephen, after their first camp with DeBoer. And I'm not suggesting that they will. And due to SEC rules, you can't leave at this point in time and remain in the SEC, so you'd have to go outside of it. So that'll be something. Jalen Milroe, how he fits the offense, you kind of hit on that. That's going to be paramount. But if you want to be a little bit more specific on the defensive side of the ball, Stephen, and I heard, I saw it in the comments, bringing this up on Feinbaum's show. How will that defense, that all the players there essentially came to play for Nick Saban, now they're playing for Kane Womack, how will they handle that? And someone said, well, basically it's just a nickel of what Nick Saban ran last year, which I don't quite buy that. But let's just say it is, Steve. Let's say it is just a nickel of what Saban liked to run. Well, a package with more defensive backs with Kool-Aid McKinstry, Terry and Arnold off to the NFL, Caleb Downs to Ohio State, Trey Amos to Ole Miss, Earl Little to Florida State, Antonio Kite to Auburn, Des Ricks to Texas A&M, and Christian Story to Kentucky. All those guys left your program this offseason. So running a package that features more defensive backs seems like a real issue to me. So who steps up in the defensive backfield? I think that's going to be critical, and they better find some answers in spring football. And again, they'll hit the transfer portal, I'm sure, but defensive back, because I think, Steven, it's going to be weird for Alabama fans. I think it's going to be offensive driven, and I don't want to say poor defense, but it's not going to be the Nick Saban dominant defense, I don't think, in Tuscaloosa under Kalen DeBoer. Do you think that's fair?
I think that's fair. I think it's fair to say that it's probably going to be a group in transition for most of the season. Right now, looking at my numbers for 2024, I only have Alabama with one returning starter in the secondary, and that's Malachi Moore. And it's not just the fact that they only have one returning starter. It's who they lost. I mean, to your point, you got two guys on the outside who were locked down, cover corners. Caleb Downs is going to be an All-American at Ohio State. They did bring Keon Sabb in from Michigan. And of course, I think the freshman class is going to be counted on a lot to fill in some of those needs at corner. So especially with the quarterbacks in the SEC this year, that's going to be a group that's going to be under the spotlight right away. And you take away a guy like Dallas Turner who could get after the quarterback, that secondary is going to be under fire right away. So I'll be interested in that. And then I thought you also brought up another point to the spring transfer portal. We've seen some guys already enter the portal the last few weeks. The portal's technically not open. So I do wonder if it might be fairly active. And I would suspect that there might be some defensive backs making their way to Tuscaloosa just based upon need.
Right. I mean, they got to field a roster somehow, so they got to do it that way. All right, Steven, how about Arkansas? Again, a lot of concerns, comments. I have a feeling I know where you're going to go with this one. What's the kind of the biggest storyline heading into Arkansas spring camp?
I want to see how big of a difference Bobby Petrino makes with the offense. I think this is one of the best coordinator hires of the offseason. Zero doubt that Petrino comes with plenty of baggage if you ask him to be a head coach. But as far as offensive coordinator, not to mention something to prove based upon the way that things ended at Arkansas before, you just look at Arkansas last year from an offensive standpoint. I mean, 4.5 yards per play, 20 points a game within SEC contest. I mean, bottom of the SEC. It can only get better from here. But there are questions. What happens to the offensive line? Can it take a step forward? The quarterback position is also a spotlight for me. Do you go with Taylon Green, Jacoby Criswell, Malachi Singleton? So I think Petrino makes a difference, but your offensive line's a question. Your quarterback is a question too. There's a lot of uncertainty here for Arkansas. So this spring, I'm going to be really interested to see how far this Arkansas offense progresses.
Yeah, we got a hot take in the comments, Steven. He said, Jeff says, Bobby Petrino, head coach before the season is over. Book it. I don't know if I want Bobby Petrino head coach of anything, but we'll see. We'll see. You hit on exactly where I was going, Steve. The quarterback competition, but the way it works now. Remember 5-10 years ago, Steven, sometimes you would get an answer. Who's your starting quarterback in spring? But now, even if there's a clear, obvious answer, they're like, nope. We got to see what these boys will do in summer when no one's watching and all that. And we got to go into fall camp because we don't want anyone transferring. So we're not going to get an answer. I don't care who stands out, but it will be fascinating to see. For me, Steven, again, it could obviously be Bobby Petrino and his influence on Arkansas, but I don't care if it's Bobby Petrino, if it's Chad Morris, if it's Jim Shady, whoever the heck is called and plays at Arkansas, I don't care. It's not going to work if they don't get that offensive line in order. So that's kind of the thing I'll be looking at the most. We got Josh Braun, Patrick Kudus, and Andrew Tremblay all back. And we've added Michigan State transfer Keyshawn Blackstock, Addison Nichols from Tennessee is a fine player, and Fernando Carmona from San Jose State. So can we mesh these pieces together, and can we just have a suitable offensive line? I mean, this should not even be a question under Sam Pittman, yet it's just been a disaster on the offensive line last year in particular, really the last 2 years has been an issue for Arkansas. So for me, Stephen, it's all about the offensive line. If we can get that going, we can solve the quarterback. We can solve play. Not that we have to solve play calling, but heck, Bobby Petrino could be the best play caller in the country. It's not going to matter if they can't block.
Yeah, I think from a quarterback perspective, I think Arkansas will get good quarterback play. I don't know who it is yet, but somebody out of this trio is probably going to be fine, and they're going to get sort of average or above average quarterback play. And each one of those guys has some intriguing skill sets. I mean, you and I have talked about Taylon Green before. I didn't think he took the step forward that I anticipated him at Boise State last year, but he's got an interesting skill set. And we saw what Petrino did with Jalen Henderson at Texas A&M, and there's some similarities there. But the offensive line to me is a much greater concern. I think the transfers they brought in will help. Can they all play at a very high level in the SEC? I think remains to be seen. If nothing else, there's a level of stability that like, if Arkansas can just get this group to be middle of the pack in the SEC, that's probably going to be good enough for this offense to be a lot better this season. So I think the pieces are there to be better. It'll be a lot of wait and see. And I think to your point, we're probably not going to learn much about the quarterbacks. And also, I would imagine there might be some need to keep things a little mysterious too. You don't want to give too much away offensively if you're Arkansas. So I don't know how much we'll learn, but I'm definitely interested in keeping an eye on Fayetteville to see what's going on with that offense.
Now, how about Auburn, Stephen? They've already started spring. They started this week. Hugh Freeze, he'll speak with the media for the first time this spring on Thursday. Hopefully he's not spending all his time recruiting and not practicing here. But what biggest question there for Auburn?
Can Peyton Thorne take a step forward? I think that's the biggest concern / level of interest for me at Auburn this season. 6-7 last year for Auburn. They were better than they were in 2022. But I think to go from 6 to 8 to 9 wins, they've got to get better quarterback play. And if it's not Peyton Thorne, is it Walker White? Is he ready to go as a freshman? Also saw some of the clips from Auburn practice and saw Cam Coleman moving around. That's pretty exciting. If you're an Auburn fan, he looks ready to be SEC ready this season. But you just look at the numbers for Auburn this season. I mean, from 2023, Peyton Thorne was at the bottom of the SEC, yards per attempt, 10 interceptions. The mobility was kind of a surprise. I don't think kind of expected him to be as mobile in this system, maybe in his first year at Auburn. So I think the question for Auburn is, can they get better quarterback play from Peyton Thorne? And I think that can unlock the whole offense for the Tigers this year. And also the receivers to go along with that. Mentioned Cam Coleman. They just need better. The passing game has to be a lot better this season to improve.
Right, and I'm going right there as well, Stephen. I mean, I'd like to see Peyton Thorne take a step up year 2 in the SEC. It remains to be seen, but I just don't know that we can trust Hugh Freeze, Stephen. I mean, 1 minute he says he's our guy. One bad bowl performance, all of a sudden the quarterback competition is wide open, even though clearly based on their transfer portal or lack of activity in the portal that maybe that's not the case. So yeah, that'll be a storyline, but that last point, and Cam Coleman specifically, like you said, we've seen some early clips of him, and basically looks like a grown man playing with a bunch of children out there on Auburn's team. Who steps up around Peyton Thorne? That's kind of my biggest concern. And we've had, I was doing a little research yesterday, Stephen, Fairweather, the tight end. Like, he was solid, right? But he led the team 38 catches, 394 yards. I think those were their led the team. I mean, that's pathetic. This is the SEC, Stephen. I mean, there are offenses in this conference that would not be in the top 5 receiving. You know what I mean? So who steps? Is it Fairweather in a year 2? Is it a Batty who entered the transfer portal and came back? We need to see players around Peyton Thorne step up because, hey, I'd be happy to be wrong, Stephen, but I think Peyton Thorne is who he is. And I don't think he's going to be amazing or anything, but he doesn't have to be if the players around him step up now that they've got rid of Philip Montgomery too, who he had a really good reputation coming into last season, but clearly on a different page than Hugh Freeze last fall.
I think keep an eye on Robert Lewis, the transfer from Georgia State. I think he could be a player, a receiver that steps in, has an opportunity to make an impact for Auburn right away. It seemed like in last season that the quarterbacks, receivers, the communication, the drop passes, whatever it was, it seemed like there was a lot of miscommunication and a lot of just not everybody was on the same page. Maybe that's where the coaching change.
Uh-oh. I think old Hugh got to Steven here. Knocked him offline. Wouldn't you know it? Well, there goes Steven. That's the product of a live show right there. But, here he is. He's back. Did Hugh come and get you? Well, I was afraid there for a moment.
Yeah, I think so. Not sure what happened.
All right, Steven, how about Florida Gators? What's the biggest question mark you got for them Gators as they go into Billy Napier's? I'm trying to think how many losing seasons he's had. What is it? Will this be year 4 or year 3?
Year 3, yeah.
Yeah.
I think pretty obvious point that Florida's going to have to be on or work on this spring, and that's the defense. Last season, when you look at it from an SEC games perspective, 33 points a game, 6.4 yards per play allowed in SEC matchups. That's not Florida defense. You think about Florida, usually near the top of the SEC in defense. Hasn't been the case so far. I like the addition of Ron Roberts. I think veteran voice on the defensive staff. You also look 7 transfers added to the defense. I think it's fair to question how many of these guys can be high-level impact guys. Some guys in the secondary, like Asa Turner, coming over from Washington, I think can help right away. But also, I think the 2 freshmen, Miles Graham and LJ McCray, the depth chart is experience, and they're also adding help from the portal and the recruiting trail. So the pieces are in place to improve. The offense wasn't the problem last year, so the defense has got to get better if Florida wants to go to a bowl game against a very difficult schedule.
Mm-hmm. Stephen Ollie says you were answering one of Hugh's DMs. That's where you went. Jeff says Auburn fans did not like your takes there. And then Anthony says you went where Shane is. Am I either? But clearly for Florida, it's got to be the defense with year 2 Austin Armstrong bringing in Ron Roberts. I mean, there's got to be a step up for the Gators on that side of the ball. Otherwise, it's just will be the same old story. Because I thought the offense, I thought they took strides last year with Graham Mertz. But that doesn't mean there aren't questions on offense. Specifically, I want to see the running back depth. Now with ETN off to Georgia, they added Cam Carroll, I believe was his name, last offseason, and it sounded like the Tulane transfer was a big hit. Unfortunately, season-ending injury. They got the young Trey Webb. So I'm not doubting that they have depth. I just kind of want to see it. And I really want to see DJ Lagway. And just, it's always foolish to expect a ton, particularly in a first camp. But I just want to see if he looks the part. I think in an ideal world, he doesn't even play. And if he doesn't play, just this year I'm talking, if he doesn't play this year, that means Florida's had a really good year and they haven't needed him. But you just never know in the SEC. He could be your savior. I want to see if he can flash that this spring.
I think there could also be some value in playing Lagway, for transfer portal purposes, basically just trying to ensure that you keep him happy and on campus. So playing him to get him ready for next season and showing that you are part of the future, we're going to showcase you. I think there could be some value in that. Also, you mentioned some of the skill talent gone. Ricky Pearsall, I thought he was so valuable. Probably a little bit underrated, maybe nationally, and certainly I think in the SEC outside of Florida. But I'm really high on Eugene Wilson too. I think there's a chance that he's a playmaker. 61 catches as a freshman last year. The offense I thought was probably a pleasant surprise. I mean, they came in last season with a lot of questions. Ended up being okay. So for me, it just goes back to, I think I trust Billy Napier that he can find ways to manufacture points and yards, but they've got to get this defense back on track if they want to have any shot to make a bowl game.
Hey, shout out Rick, $50 donation. NIL says SEC Mike's worth 50 gig 'em. I appreciate you, Rick. No question there, but we'll get to A&M here in a moment here, and I'm bumping I'm bumping Aggies up to 10 wins for that $50 donation. How about that, Steven? But yeah, I mean, Florida's they're going to be a team to watch. We've all seen the schedule and everything like that. But, whew, man, there's got to be some answers. Hey, real quick, while we're talking Florida, I mean, I like to poke fun, obviously, but they just hired Dan Enos. Of course, let's hope and pray he's just an analyst. Don't let him coach quarterbacks, call the offense. I know they're dying for a play caller down there. Thoughts on Dan Enos going to Florida?
I think in an off-field role, I think that's okay. I will say, if I was a head coach, I would probably accumulate as many experienced coaches, coordinators as I can to evaluate tape and do all the off-field stuff. So I guess as long as you don't allow him to have a headset on game days, I think that's okay. Yeah.
All right, Steve. So maybe the team that was the most difficult to come up with a concern here or storyline heading into spring, Georgia Bulldogs. What you got for I almost said 3-time national champion, Steven, because they came a hair away from doing it. But 2 out of the last 3. What's any concerns for Georgia?
Man, I had to spend a lot of time coming up with one for Georgia. I guess in terms of spring storyline, there's a lot of intrigue, obviously, like to see Carson Beck. Can he take, what's the offense look like in his second year? They've got a lot of good weapons at the, receiver spots too. So it's sort of like growth. But I think if there is one kind of, not necessarily concern, but if there's something that I'm going to be watching, it's the defensive reload. It's hard to get worried about a defense that's coached by Kirby Smart and Glenn Schumann and Travaris Robinson, but they are losing a lot in the secondary. Kamari Lassiter, Javon Bullard, Tyke Smith, losing a couple guys up front. Jamon Dumas-Johnson, I know he got pushed out kind of by C.J. Allen, but he transferred to Kentucky. So talent not in short supply. There are some things defensively I think they can work on. They've lost some depth to the portal. So I'll be curious to see maybe how this group develops. Are there some other guys that are coming up, freshman, sophomore, that are backups that we should be on the lookout for breakout seasons, and we'll see that this spring?
Any concern at all, Steven? This is kind of where I went. Not that there's a lot of places to go, it's not a huge concern for me, but losing Brock Bowers, losing Ladd McConkey, Kendall Milton, Juwan Edwards, Marcus Rosemy St. Jack. I mean, these are some critical pieces, not to mention some offensive linemen that'll be playing in the NFL very soon. All those players, you hit on the defensive losses, but maybe overall, and I know Georgia's uniquely positioned to replace star players like this, but maybe it's not even the production as much, Stephen, as it is leadership, as it is guys that have been through the wars it's like this last team, the expectation was championship or bust. Not to say that isn't the expectation next year either, but there is some, I don't know if doubt's the right word, but like Carson Beck, I think he's the best quarterback in the SEC, right? And I think he's going to be on Heisman boards and all this, but what has he done to earn any of that? I mean, he lost to Alabama. Nice moments in the regular season, but is he the leader of this team that's going to be expected to win a national championship? I'm not saying he isn't, but I guess just overall loss of leadership and production and players that have been there before, that's kind of my biggest concern or question mark.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. And not to mention that your season is now longer too, with the expansion of the playoff. You're going to be playing probably 1 or 2 more games against, high profile opponents if you're Georgia and you're 1 or 2 in the playoff seeding. So I do think, I think leadership, it's fair to wonder how, the handoff from one team to another. Now they have handled it very well the last couple of years. They lost all those guys to the NFL and just simply reloaded and won the national championship in 2022. I do think one pickup that Georgia had that kind of went under the radar, and that was Ben Yurosek, the tight end from Stanford. He was hurt last season. They had a coaching change. Their quarterbacks weren't very good at Stanford. I think he could be a really nice player. They have Oscar Delp and Lawson Lucky coming back too. So I don't expect him to be Brock Bowers, but I think that tight end room, they still have three pretty solid players. You add in the transfers that they brought at receiver, guys like Dominic Lovett coming back to, and Trevor Etienne transferring in from Florida. It really feels like that supporting cast is in a really good spot for Carson Beck to be, like you said, one of the front runners to win the Heisman.
And one quick thing on Georgia, Stephen, just the fact that, you would be more qualified than I am, because I know you're working on the Athlon preseason magazine. It's going to come out around May, I believe. I don't need to tell you that. You know a lot better than I would. But as I've just pulled it up, I got the schedule up here. At Alabama, at Texas, at Ole Miss. I have to feel like those are three, at least on paper, top 10-ish type teams. Clemson, I didn't realize, had 18 starters coming back, and they ended the season on a winning streak. Yeah, Georgia probably should beat all these teams, or at least they'll be, favored to do so. So I'm not sitting here saying they're going to be mountain losses or anything, but given the fact that last year the schedule was more or less a cakewalk, or as much as it could be in the SEC, and then you're coming into this gauntlet. Given the concerns that we had, could the schedule be like, just imagine if they lose at Alabama, a game I think everybody's expecting them to win now because of a coaching change. If they lose to Texas, let's say Texas is a top 3 team in the country, I mean, all of a sudden they're playing for their playoff lives. And I realize that, 2 losses is very unlikely, but if it does, and hell, maybe Kirby wants it that way. Maybe he wants them to every game mean something, because in a 12-team format at 10-2, they're still getting in with that schedule. So I'm not saying they'd be eliminated, but I guess I'm just saying, with that schedule, with the losses, does that concern you at all?
I don't think so. I think that this team is pretty well equipped.
I tried to set it up, and you just smashed it.
I was going to make a note on Carson Beck, and I thought it was interesting. I was thinking about this the other day. Their schedule, and they played in so many I guess they would say one-sided matchups, but they were favorable games for Georgia. And you look at his numbers, how he led the SEC in passing yards. A few more games like against Texas, they got Alabama, they'll play Ole Miss. They may play one of those in the SEC championship. We're coming into the season wondering, hey, who's going to be the Heisman frontrunner? Well, Carson Beck had some pretty good numbers last year, and he's going to have a lot more high-profile games. So if you wanted to make the case that he could be a Heisman frontrunner, to me, like, the schedule sets up a little bit more favorably. But also, I think, we've seen this. I think Georgia will play and maybe it's not fair, but they will play the disrespect card. We saw that no one believed in them in 2022 and they won it all. I'm sure somebody's going to pick against them this year, and Kirby's going to make it well known throughout the facility. So I'm not too worried about Georgia this year.
Yeah, I know. No, they shouldn't be, but I'm just trying to find reasons. Like I said, it took a long time to even come up with what I just threw at you there.
That's normally what we would do for Alabama, right? Like under Nick Saban. That's
All right, Stephen, how about Kentucky, a program that I think there's a ton of legitimate concerns entering 2024?
My biggest question this spring is the offense. Can the pieces fall into place on offense? This is an offense that's going to have a new offensive coordinator in Bush Hamdan, sort of a late arrival. Not too worried, because they'll have the spring, summer, and fall to figure things out. You also look at the quarterback change, Brock Vandegrift, and if he doesn't work out, there's really not another option behind him. Experience coming back on the offensive line. They've brought in some, Chip Trainium to fill in at running back. And you and I have talked about, I really love those receivers, Barian Brown and Dane Key. But new coordinator, new quarterback, a lot of questions here. How does it all fit together? How does it look? Kentucky's offense is what I'm watching out of Lexington this spring.
Right. And I think more specifically, I think everybody's going to look at Brock Vandegrift, Stephen, and see how he fits into the offense. But I think it's paramount that we get the offensive line in order under Eric Wolford, who has been there before. Went down to Alabama. Now he's back. And they kind of mocked him on his way out the door. So this is a weird, environment here. But when he was there, they had the big blue wall, and that was legitimate. And they have lost that since that time. So can they regain that? They got talent on the line of scrimmage, Stephen. And it's not always been guys that are overly talented. They were probably better when they were guys they had to develop. And we're not star players, and not 5 stars that are there for a year and then they transfer. You know what I mean? Like maybe they got out of the blue collarness, so to speak. But I'm a little concerned, Stephen. I'm gonna throw up their schedule real quick, Kentucky. That this is a program that now that there's no more East Division, now that you got to play everybody in the SEC, that forces you to go to Ole Miss, place they went a couple years ago. It forces you to play Auburn, which is in Lexington, but I would assume that we'd probably favor Auburn in that game, but it's close to a toss-up. But then the other one, at Texas, which I don't know that anybody short of Georgia is going to be favored going to Austin this year. So I don't know. It's a tougher road. And I'm a little concerned, Stephen, about Kentucky and how they fit into the new look SEC.
Yeah, certainly I think the schedule could be a lot more difficult for Kentucky on an annual basis. I mean, I think they've done a nice job of scheduling basically 3 guaranteed victories, and then you get the rivalry game against Louisville at the end of the year. But also that series is probably going to get tougher now that Jeff Brom's over at Louisville too. So yeah, I share your concern. And like we've talked about this offseason, you have this unusual scenario where your head coach was the head coach of another team for like 10 minutes. And now it's back at Lexington, and I guess everything's okay. He brought back an offensive line coach that, like you said, they kind of mocked out the door. I didn't think Eric Wolford was all that great at Alabama. It's a little puzzling to me what happened there, considering I thought he did some good things at Kentucky. So I think there's a lot of questions here. And not to mention, I think it's fair to wonder, what's the next kind of step or what's the next progression for this program under Mark Stoops. And we'll find out a lot this year because of all these changes. I mean, you're breaking in a new quarterback, new offensive coordinator. Can you get this offensive line that has 4 returning starters and a pretty good foundation, a couple transfers? Like, there's some things to like here, but I mean, there's just a ton of unknown with Bush Hamden taking over play calling to go with Brock Vandegrift, very talented, but very unproven quarterback too.
And I don't know if this has been asked or insinuated or anything, Stephen, but do you think at all, and this may not be the case, because you just never know what opportunities arise, but given that Liam Cohen came back to Kentucky and then Mark Stoops, like you said there, he was a pen signing away from being A&M's coach. Of course, maybe he would have taken Cohen with him. I don't know, but because it seemed like ever since then, Liam Cohen has been trying to get out of Lexington. I don't know. I don't know if that led to Liam Cohen being like, all right, maybe Stoops is trying to escape here. I'm going to get out of here while I can. You think that could be at all realistic?
Possibly. Would you also worry maybe about head coach meddling too much in offense? Maybe, sort of like if you're, sort of like Petrino and Fisher didn't really get along. The head coach wanted to put too much of an emphasis on what he wanted to do offensively. Mm-hmm. I mean, Liam Cohen's job as offensive coordinator back when was 2021 when it was his first year was really impressive. So I think there's probably some truth in both. Probably the fact that Stoops may have hit his ceiling at Kentucky and trying to find the next step forward if you're Liam Cohen, but also I think maybe the head coach might be, just a theory of mine, he might be meddling too much in the offense.
Yeah. All right. So Stephen, LSU, I think this one's pretty easy. Where are you going there?
Can the defense get back on track? I mean, it was a year that was very un-LSU like on defense. 13th in the SEC in points allowed, 6.1 yards per play. We keep going. They were at the bottom of the SEC against the run, against the pass. It was all bad last year. So I love what they did from a staff perspective. Blake Baker coming in as coordinator. I think this group will be a lot more aggressive in 2024. Bo Davis is defensive line coach, one of the best in the country. They've upgraded their staff. I do think there's still some questions with this group. Like, they are a little thin on the defensive line. Is the secondary going to be any better this year? I think Harold Perkins moving to the inside again is going to be another fascinating deal for LSU this year. I would suspect that Blake Baker does a better job of utilizing him. But that's going to be a storyline if he gets off to another slow start this year. So
you're already seeing the Baton Rouge natives get restless, Stephen, once they came out with that. Now, maybe he's got more time to fit into that role. And yes, I thought Baker did an outstanding job with his linebackers at Missouri. So, and he was a linebacker coach at LSU before he went to Missouri. He knows what he's doing when it comes to linebacker play. So he's got one of the better defensive coordinators to work with him. So, but that is fascinating. And yes, this has to be the answer, is the defense. I think Garrett Nussmeier is experienced enough to where he's not a returning starter, but to me, it feels like it. And in that building, it probably feels like it. So I don't have, as great as Jaden Daniels was, and Garrett Nussmeier clearly is a different player. He's not Jaden Daniels. I'm not suggesting that he's going to be that good, or as good, I should say. I think he'll be good. But it's all about the defense. And blowing up the defensive staff was a right decision. It was and it was a tough decision, I would think, Stephen, after winning 10 games back-to-back years. But they were never going to go over, championship hump, not with the defensive staff they had. But let me ask you this, Stephen. I'm going to throw up LSU schedule because I was thinking about this week. Is there anybody in the SEC, you think, that has got more pressure next season to win just a single game than Brian Kelly will have when November 9th, Alabama comes to town under Kalen DeBoer? And I'm not one of these people that thinks Alabama's going to suck and they're going to be 6-6, or I think they're probably going to win 9 or 10, maybe even 11 games. But I don't think Brian Kelly can afford to go 1-2 against Alabama with 2 home games among those 3 with a first-year Kalen DeBoer. I mean, I think he's got to. They don't have to dominate Alabama moving forward, but they've got to at least defend the home field. And he's done it. He did it against Nick Saban. If he's losing to Kalen DeBoer, I'm having real concerns about LSU and if they can win a national championship under Brian Kelly. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree. I think it may be kind of almost too simplistic to look at it like this. I think Alabama enters the season as probably more vulnerable than they have been in some time. And we could have said that about last year's team. And LSU had the Heisman Trophy winning quarterback, and they got beat on the road in Tuscaloosa. Not total surprising, but LSU beat them the year before, and they won the SEC West. And then they came into the last year with high expectations. I think they were fine, but obviously I think they didn't quite meet the expectations defensively, I think, as most people would have hoped for that performance. But I think with Alabama being vulnerable and losing the greatest coach in college football history, combined with some of the other questions here, it's an opportunity for LSU to beat Alabama consistently or a little bit more frequently than they have been. So I think if you're Brian Kelly and you're looking at this going, we just spent a ton of money to upgrade our defensive staff. And if you lose to Alabama in that game in a year where they're vulnerable, it's probably not going to sit well in Baton Rouge.
Yeah, and I know you referenced this earlier, Stephen, but it just got me thinking. Yeah, Nick Saban meeting with Kane Womack to kind of help install and implement and mesh or whatever you want to call it. And I think that's the right thing because these coaches always look like fools. Like I think it was Jim McElwain when he was at Florida, and he didn't talk to Spurrier. You know what I mean? Or whoever it was.
Zach Arnett last year deciding to change offensive schemes.
Right. I mean. Sometimes these coaches do things and you're like, what in the world are they thinking? And so I think it is the right move to do that. But at what point is there a cutoff? You know what I mean? Like, let's say Georgia, complete hypothetical here. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but let's say Georgia scores like 45 on Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And then all of a sudden, Nick Saban goes on College Game Day and says, well, I think they should have been blitzing the corners more, or what have you know what I mean? And then he's kind of blurring the line of like, well, why in the hell ain't Kane Womack listening to Nick Saban? I mean, it's almost like a situation set up to fail. And I'm a little concerned that Saban's, I don't know, this is already making news. And I'm just wondering at what point does it stop or is he just a defensive analyst for Alabama the rest of his life,
I mean, you think about that game. Like, isn't it the high probability of College game day being in Tuscaloosa for Georgia, Alabama is pretty high, right? So the first time that Nick Saban makes his way down the sidelines, it's going to be, is Nick Saban taking over the call sheet? We're going to see all the jokes and all the trolling on Twitter, I'm sure. I kind of think if I'm Alabama, and I think if I'm Kane Womack, I think for the first year, I think trying to mesh these two philosophies in this personnel is probably the way to go. And then going forward, I think maybe you get more of what you want to do, especially because you're built to win this year and you can start filling in the gaps and sort of easing your way into the scheme in 2025 and 2026. You don't want to go too much away from what's worked. And especially if that personnel fits, because you don't want to have a situation like you talked about where the scheme, the production just falls off and you end up with an 8-4 season at Alabama. So I don't mind it. But I think eventually Womack will have to just do what he wants to do and not rely on Nick Saban as a defensive analyst there.
All right, Stephen, how about Mississippi State? I think this one, to me, was pretty obvious, but I'm curious to hear where you're going first spring under Jeff Lebby.
I want to see how the offense looks. Jeff Lebby handpicked Blake Shapen, the Baylor transfer, to be a starting quarterback. Michael Van Buren, the true freshman, will be there as well this offseason. So, number one, you've got an interesting quarterback battle. And I think for a team like Mississippi State, in my early numbers, they have only 3 returning starters. That's the fewest of any team in the SEC. Nobody on the offensive line, some experience back at receiver. They've got some interesting running backs, though. How does this all come together? You've got a team that's probably going to be picked near the bottom of the SEC. If you're going to lose, it's probably better to lose if you're going to be exciting. So I think if you're Mississippi State, can you get this offense high octane as fast as possible and make it interesting?
Mm-hmm. First, shout out Wesley Williams, $5 donation. Appreciate you, Wesley. He likes the new background. Mike Govalls. And I'm going to kick you out real quick, Stephen. Hopefully it doesn't kick you out for good. I just want to show up the full background here. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so appreciate you, Wesley, and Steven's back, so I didn't get rid of you for good or anything.
Hugh didn't come back this time. So.
But I think back to Mississippi State, Steven, I think you're dead on. I mean, the way I look at it, and maybe this isn't fair because every situation is unique, Steven, but I look at it like Josh Heupel when he took over at Tennessee. I look at it like Lane Kiffin when he took over at Ole Miss. It's the same offense. That's why I'm kind of going that way. And I believe they each had transfer. No, Ole Miss, he inherited Matt Corral. But I know Tennessee certainly had transfer quarterbacks. But I think Mississippi State is only going to be as good as the offense can take them in year one. Now, that can change. But given Jeff Lebby's background, we know he'll get the most out of his quarterback. And I thought he did a tremendous job with Oklahoma, getting the most out of Dylan Gabriel that we've seen in college football. I actually just went back and watched the Red River game last night. What a game that was. I mean, that was a classic there, dialed up by Jeff Lebby. But if we can get that excitement, Stephen, to where at any point they're a threat to score, throw it all over the yard, and the secret to that offense, Stephen, is people overlook the running game. I think they'll be far more proficient running the football as well in Starkville under Jeff Lebby. But again, I expect the defense is going to be borderline terrible. And that's just this year because it's a new scheme, all the turnover. But we're going to have to outscore people. So how smooth is this offensive install in spring? That's kind of going to be the biggest storyline in Starkville, I think.
Yeah, I think you said it best there. I think you're just going to have to outscore people this year because when you look at their defensive returning personnel, just 2 returning starters. And we know guys like Nathaniel Watson and Jet Johnson played a ton of ball, ton of tackles for this Mississippi State defense. There is a lot to replace on that side of the ball. I do think if you look at some of the ingredients of this offense, a lot of it, we've touched on the quarterbacks, but they've got to replace all 5 starters on the offensive line. And, they brought in 4 transfers from the portal, including a couple from power conferences, a couple guys from the G5s that have played a lot of ball. So it's an interesting mix. But trying to implement a new scheme, trying to break in a quarterback, trying to figure out how your receiver, the pecking order is going to be. Keep an eye. I mentioned his name before. Keep an eye on Kelly Akari, the UTEP transfer. He's a guy who could really stretch the field and a big play threat for Mississippi State. But you got a lot of new here. Your offensive line's basically brand new. Quarterback uncertainty. It's a lot to figure out. But if this system, if it hits well, there's a chance that this team will be fun to watch because their offense could be entertaining and high scoring this year.
Yeah, and you referenced that offensive line. The offensive line coach is Cody Kennedy, who was at Arkansas, who, again, they had massive troubles on the offensive line last season. But when he was working with Kendall Browse at Arkansas, I thought the offensive line was a lot better. So I think Cody Kennedy knows what he's getting into with this offensive system. And like you said, they've an entirely new unit they have attacked via the transfer portal. So meshing all these pieces together, Cody Kennedy's going to have his hands full this spring, but that's why he's getting paid the big bucks to do it. All right, Steven, how about...
Sure.
Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think it's hard to hide offensive line problems in the SEC. And that'll be, I mean, for as good as Levy's probably going to be at play calling and entertaining as this could be, it's going to be really hard to hide this if the offensive line struggles, much like it did last year for Mississippi State.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, where they didn't struggle, Steven, that's at Missouri. What do you got for them Tigers? What's the thing you'll be looking out for the most, which they have already started spring as well down in Columbia?
So I think the biggest question mark is going to be Cody Schrader. Obviously, I think the loss of Cody Schrader is going to be a big storyline, but I actually think that Missouri is going to be okay at running back. I mean, I think they're going to miss his leadership and his all-around production, but I like Marcus Carroll, the transfer from Georgia State. They also picked up one from Appalachian State too. So I think my biggest concern / question is the defense. There's a ton of turnover on this side of the ball. There's a new coordinator. I mean, studs like Darius Robinson, Teron Hopper. You look at the secondary, Rakestraw, Carlise, Abrams Drain are all gone. It's one of the best defenses in the SEC, and there's a lot of change and turnover here. So I think as good as Cody Schrader is, and he will be missed, I think there are greater concerns here for Missouri on defense.
Yeah, that's where I went with the new look. And I don't know it'll be a new look, but Corey Batoon, and go back and check it out, Mizzou fans. If you missed it, we had Gabe DeOrman from Power Mizzou on a couple weeks ago, and I asked him, I was like, "What do we know about Batoon?" And he said, "Well, not much." So if he doesn't know, certainly we hardly anyone's going to know outside of that building there until camp, which again has already started. But I don't think it's going to be completely rebuilt. They're in a tricky spot, though, Stevie, because not only is it the coordinator change, they've lost a couple position coaches, but they have attacked it well via the transfer portal, shoring up potential weaknesses. They got Williams and Wari, the arguably the number one defensive lineman in the entire country. I mean, anytime you get guys like that, you'd like to see them making an impact year one, and that doesn't mean they have to dominate or anything like that, but just, making big time plays in key situations, get those one-on-ones. So I'm not sitting here saying Missouri's going to be bad, but I'm just concerned about what it does look like with all the changeover on the defensive side of the ball. I'm also looking at quarterback depth because with Sam Horn out, I don't know who we have as a backup. We got nothing there. And just overall leadership, because there were some really strong leaders that are on their way to the NFL. Something you kind of alluded to after an 11-win campaign there.
I think the defensive transfer class from Missouri is pretty strong too, like you mentioned. Certainly, we talked about Carroll and the other running back they brought in from the transfer portal. But you look, guys like Darius Smith from Georgia, Zion Young from Michigan State, McClellan from Florida. There's a lot of high-end impact guys potentially on this defense. And so I think the transition period could be pretty short for Missouri. But still, there's also, you add a new coordinator, you add in some guys who were upperclassmen, senior leaders, and you're replacing them with guys in the portal. It's just a question of how fast can they get it up to speed and kind of get back to playing at last year's level. I'm very the hire of Corey Batoon was pretty surprising for me from Missouri, but also at the same time, I mean, Blake Baker probably wasn't the most popular hire when he was at Missouri because he struggled before as a coordinator. Kirby Moore was pretty solid too. Those have both worked out for Missouri. So I think Eli Drinkowitz probably deserves the benefit of the doubt here after 2 pretty strong coordinator hires the last go round.
And I wanted to ask you this, Stephen. I'm going to throw up Brady Cook's stats here, but I heard someone else referencing that he could be the best quarterback in the SEC next season if he continues to improve. And just what a remarkable athlete he is. We know he's got Luther Burden, who I think he's the best receiver in the country. He's got Theo Weiss. He's got an emerging tight end, Brent Nortfleet. You referenced the running backs they've added this offseason, and we all know they've added touted offensive linemen as well. So if Brady Cook, he gets respect. I'm not saying he's disrespected or anything, but he gets very little to no respect being perhaps the best quarterback in the SEC. But I guess I'm asking you, if let's say he takes a bigger step as he made last year, he does it again, will he be the best quarterback in the SEC?
Man, it's going to be a good debate, because of just how many good quarterbacks are coming back in this league. I think if you wanted to make the case that he could, I think it would start with, if I'm Missouri and I know I have all this transition, I have a new coordinator on defense, I'm going to need my offense to be even better this year. And I think the confidence that Missouri should have from his play and growth from 2022 to 2023, plus the weapons they're going to have at receiver, like they can deploy this offense to another level. So I think if I was making the case for it, I would just say Cook was so much better from the previous year that he can get better. The scheme's the second season, and they have the weapons to do so. Plus, Caden Green coming in from Oklahoma is a huge addition on the offensive line from Missouri. So that would be my case. I think it's going to be pretty crowded at the top of the SEC, but the potential is there.
Right. All right. Well, speaking of Caden Green, let's go to Oklahoma. Stephen, what's the biggest question for the Sooners as they enter life in the SEC?
I said this a few minutes ago with Mississippi State, but it applies here for Oklahoma. You can't hide offensive line problems in the SEC, or it's difficult to, I should say. 5 new starters for Oklahoma along the offensive line, complete rebuilding effort. Mentioned his name before, but Bill Bedenbaugh, the offensive line coach at Oklahoma, is one of the best in the country. I think they'll get this figured out. They have 4 transfers coming in, guys who played at some power conference opponents or teams. So, and to mix with some guys who played last year. So the foundation is not bad, but you're coming into a league where it's one thing in the Big 12. The schedule is going to be a lot more challenging in the SEC. You're going to play a lot more just better defensive fronts. So Oklahoma's got to get this offensive line figured out fast.
Yeah, I mean, that's just such the obvious answer. I had to go with it as well. Replaces so many guys up there. And I believe their right tackle is being touted as one of the best prospects at the tackle position in the upcoming draft. Caden Green, obviously, that was a big departure. But, and again, remains to be seen. I don't think they're doing like a complete blow up of the offense. They'd be foolish to do it. It was so successful last year. But this offense also tends to cover up issues that you have on offense because of the tempo, because of the speed to which you're snapping the football and getting rid of the football. I think you can kind of mask it somewhat. Now, you obviously can't do it in short yardage and goal line situations, but yeah, and you reference their outstanding offensive line coach. I mean, every time I bring him up, I hear about this offensive line coach. So I'll be very curious to see what he can work with. So I think that's fair because, there's some people that think Oklahoma's going to win 6-7 games in their first SEC season. And if that's true, it's going to be because the offensive line is just dreadful. There's a lot of people that think they can win 8, 9, maybe even 10 games in their debut. So, I mean, this is going to be one of the more fascinating teams in the SEC this fall for me.
I think if the offensive line is solid or just fine, you look at what Oklahoma brings back. They had some injuries at running back last year, but I think they're fine there. Their weapons at receiver. I mean, Deion Burks, Nick Anderson, Jalil Farouk. I mean, they have got playmakers on the outside. And you and I have talked about how much we like Jackson Arnold as a breakout candidate this year. I mean, we'll find out right away. You look at that schedule. I mean, September 21st playing Tennessee, James Pierce against that Oklahoma offensive line. Then you go to Auburn, and not to mention the big one against Texas. So by October 12th, we should have a pretty good idea about that Oklahoma offensive line.
And who is Tulane's coach now, Steven? Is it the guy from Troy?
Yeah, John Sumrall. Still a pretty dangerous team on September 14th, but probably not as dangerous as they would have been had they played them the last 2 years.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, point being, I just know he's a heck of a coach. So
yeah,
that is not one that I think Oklahoma fans should just be, you expect to win a game like that, obviously, but you can't just pencil that one in. All right, how about Ole Miss, even a popular playoff projections here for the Ole Miss Rebels, given this offseason? So what is a big concern, question mark, what have you, about the Rebels going into spring?
I think you probably know where I'm going with this one. I think not many concerns for me offensively about this Ole Miss team. Obviously, losing Quinshad Judkins as a transfer was a big deal. But the defense, I want to see how far this defense progresses. They gave up about 27 points in SEC games last year. With all the transfers they're bringing in, plus Pete Golding in his second year, can this group take a big step forward? And this spring will be a good first step for them. So interested just to see how all these new pieces mesh together for a team that's got a lot of expectations in 2024.
Yeah. Comment of the night so far, Steven. We got to give it to Sandman real quick. Imagine your mascot being a mobile home. He's taking a shot at the Sooners, of course. But, I just had to share that one. But, yeah, I think right there, year 2 under Pete Golding, you're adding all these pieces. And really, even last year, added some intriguing defensive pieces. Didn't quite see that come together on the field when we wanted to. So, again, Ole Miss they don't need to be dominant on the defensive side of the football, but I think they are going to be the best offense in the SEC this year. I really do. So if you're the best, well, maybe Georgia might be there too. But I'm giving the edge to Ole Miss right now. Let's say they have the best offense. If they're going to make the playoff, their defense has got to be in the upper echelon of the SEC. And with Pete Golding, with the pieces they've added, there's no reason it can't be. Maybe just force a ton of turnovers, things of that nature. And that's your key to not only making the playoff, but winning some games, maybe winning a championship. I'm going to be fascinated to see what this Ole Miss defense looks like year 2 under Pete Golding, with a very, very manageable schedule with, again, maybe only 2 to 3 games where they're actually an underdog.
I think, just as you look at that schedule and you're also thinking about last season for Ole Miss, last season's production on offense and defense gets them to the playoff in the 12-team era. Improvement gets them deep into the field. And I think that's really kind of, to me, when I look at this this defense for this season. I mean, you're adding Walter Nolan, you're adding a Chris Paul from Arkansas, you're adding, I think, 6-7 defensive backs from the transfer portal. This is about, with a favorable schedule, you're all in on trying to make a deep run at the college football playoff. So the defense, if it's just as good as it was last year, that's good enough to get there. But if they can get this group to another level, you're talking about Ole Miss being able to actually win some games and potentially get to that semifinals of the college football playoff.
And I think it'll do something for college football, Stephen, even if you're not an Ole Miss fan. Let's say you're a South Carolina fan or a Kentucky fan or any of these teams where people generally think you got no shot to win anything of significance. I think people will start looking at the Ole Miss model. If they have a big year, and I'm not saying they can do it every year because not even the big boys do it every year, but when you have a senior quarterback, when you got both your coordinators coming back, when you got key pieces coming together, and you can get your NIL in order, it can make you very competitive in the transfer portal to shore up your deficiencies. And why not? Why not us? It would be what I'm asking. If Ole Miss does big things this year, and I know some people hate the portal, they hate transfer, NIL, all this. Well, it's here, and it's here to stay. So why not do what Ole Miss is doing, if it works, and do the same thing around college football, and we'll probably get a lot of new teams in the college football playoff on an annual basis.
I think the playoff can sell hope a lot. It's going to be hard for, I think, everyone to get past the Georgias, Ohio States of the world, and Alabama if it's operating at a high level. But the combination of things you mentioned there, the 12-team playoff, it gives teams access. If there is one, if we go to 14, you're going to be getting even more access down the road. But the transfer portal, I think, even if it is chaotic, if you have a need, you can go out and fill it right away. So I think in the past we'd see these teams with kind of these glaring weaknesses. Well, that's not the case anymore. And if you get the right combination of things, that hope of making the playoff kind of entices teams maybe to go a little bit more all in, much like Ole Miss is doing this season.
Mm-hmm. All right. How about South Carolina, Stephen? I wonder where you're going to go. That's a clue as to where I'm going. But what do you got for the Gamecocks?
I want to see if the development of Lenora Sellers is on track. I love the sample size. When you look at the performance of 4 for 4 for 86 yards against Furman, a 36-yard touchdown run against Vanderbilt. If you get that performance in every game, you're talking Heisman Trophy for Lenora Sellers. I think it's fair to say it's probably not going to continue. That being said, though, I think obviously South Carolina, tough schedule, a lot of questions with this team. I do like what they've done in the portal offensively. Offensive line has to improve. But to me, Sellers, if he is as good as we think he can be, he's the difference maker. That helps South Carolina go from, five wins to maybe 6 or 7 this year.
Yeah, so I've got that circled in red ink as well, Stephen. Lenora Sellers. Is the hype warranted? Because these Gamecock fans are over the moon over Sellers. I hope he delivers and they exceed expectations, which Beamer has done 2 out of the 3 years he's been there. So I think it's crazy. I mean, we got people in the comments, will Beamer survive another year? I mean, I think that's craziness. Now, of course, if they win 2 or 3 games, maybe get back to me. Then we can run him off. Yeah. But, I think he's won enough big-time games. Clearly, things didn't go well for him last year. But if Sellers is 1A, I'm going to go 1B is that offensive line, Stephen. Is it? I mean, because last year, quite frankly, it was a train wreck. And that was with solid quarterback play. And it's still, I mean, wasn't it 10 sacks in the opener? I mean, I'm surprised somebody didn't get fired that night. You know what I mean? Like, that's like Pee-wee football. You know what I mean? I mean, it was that bad. And I don't care how good Sellers is. If the offensive line is that poor again, it's not going to matter. Unless he's freaking Cam Newton back there. But, they have got to get the offensive line figured out. And if they can do that, I think Sellers could be set up for success next season, given a schedule that is, on paper, it's pretty formidable. But I like the way this breaks it down. If they can get wins like week 2 at Kentucky, again, no guarantees there. But Brian Kelly, notorious, loses games probably he shouldn't on the road. I'm making the case for some potential upsets here, but I think South Carolina can have a solid record if Lenora Sellers is worth the hype this year.
Yeah, I do too. I think that schedule does set up, favorably. I mean, obviously your October schedule and then your start of November with getting Texas A&M at home, that's 4 potential top 25 teams and 2 top 10 teams. But your first 4 games, Kentucky, I would say, is probably could, it's the Sunglasses Bowl. It could be a toss up. They'll certainly be an underdog against LSU. But if you can survive that, those last 4 games, they'll be an underdog against Missouri, but you get them at home, and then you get, of course, a shot at Clemson, who they beat, the last time they went up to Death Valley. So if Sellers is as good as we think he can be, and South Carolina fans are hyping him up, I mean, all of a sudden that in-season growth could really pay off for a fast finish in the month of November.
Yeah, and I just can't wait for that game against Missouri at home, because I don't know what it is. I think it's going to, I really do. After winning 11 games, Stephen, I think it's going to change at media days where everybody's just chalks up Mizzou as a win, but I'm not guaranteeing that it changes. So it's going to be pretty funny if South Carolina fans, Arkansas fans, on and on and on, think Missouri is some kind of guaranteed win when, I don't think Drake's ever lost to South Carolina, even at his previous school.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's Missouri. The perception of Missouri has changed quite a lot in one season after winning 11 games. And I think to go back to something that you said earlier about the theme of like a team that's got hope, and sort of like that Missouri theme of like kind of why stop here, why not us, and so that's a team like South Carolina is if things can get rolling in the right direction. You could easily see with NIL transfer and stuff, they could start to build some momentum during the season. So I think definitely one of the more intriguing teams to me is South Carolina, especially considering they usually finish trending up at the end of the year.
All right, how about for Cousin Shane? We're doing this one, Steven. Tennessee, biggest question mark you have for Tennessee going into spring?
I think I don't know if Cousin Shane is auditioning to be a defensive back in Josh Heupel's system, but boy, do they need him. I mean, you look at the secondary numbers the last couple seasons, they've yet to finish higher than 8th in pass efficiency defense. They were 11th in the SEC, allowing over 65% completion percentage last year. We could go down the list of names. They lose a ton of them. They brought in some transfers from the portal. Is somebody like Ricky Gibson ready to step up this year and be a player for that secondary? So a lot of turnover in Tennessee secondary. It's a question mark once again. I've got my eye on seeing if that group improves this year.
Yeah, that's exactly where I went, Steven. You hit it. I mean, Kamal Hadden, NFL, Warren Burrell, Georgia Tech, Danico Slatter, Arkansas, Tamarian McDonald, Ole Miss, Brandon Turnage, Ole Miss, Jack Luttrell, Arizona, Deshaun Rucker, South Florida. They are filling the portal with defensive backs. But to your point also, I mean, I'm not calling any of those guys out. Maybe it's a scheme. I don't know. I mean, Hadden was really good. He had a really good year. But most of those other guys, I don't know. I don't know how big of a loss they are. They do have transfers incoming. They've got 3, 4 sophomores that they're really counting on this year. Jordan Matthews, Ricky Gibson, you referenced Christian Conyer, John Slaughter. So it's completely new look secondary. That could be great. That could be bad. I don't know. But Tennessee's probably going to have to outscore people again. So, again, we don't need, kind of similar to Ole Miss, we don't need a lockdown defense. We need an opportunistic defense. We need to not give up 60-something points to freaking South Carolina. That would be great. And as long as they don't do anything foolish like that, I think Tennessee is set up for a really great season as well, given their schedule. And, I mean, again, I think 9 to 10 wins. People saying 10 wins for Tennessee, if they can take care of business, I think is very, very realistic. But the critical one is going to be probably October 12th, Florida. They can never beat Florida. If they could beat Florida. But, a much more difficult game on paper is the following week, October 19th, Alabama at home. If somehow they could sweep those two, I think Tennessee's going to the college football playoff. What would you say about that?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I'm looking at that schedule, and the only game that I think they will be a for sure underdog is Georgia on November 16th. Like, I think September 21st against Oklahoma, October 19th against Alabama. We'll see. I think those are the early season will tell us a lot about what the line could be for both teams. With Alabama in a state of transition, if they look good early in the season in Kalen DeBoer's first year, I think Alabama will be favored there. But I think there's a good chance that Tennessee's favored at least in 10 or 11 games. And I think 10-2 is very doable with this schedule. On the secondary too, you can look at it at one thing. On one hand, they are losing a lot of guys. On the other hand, they really weren't very good. So, I mean, maybe you're getting guys that just fit the scheme better, guys who might be a little bit more athletic. There's 100 different reasons that it could be. But, man, they've got to get this group figured out if they want to be a factor in winning a couple games in the playoff.
Right, and maybe I'm just saying this, Steven, to get Cousin Shane hopefully back on the show at some point, but I'm buttering him up here. You look at their SEC games: Oklahoma, new quarterback, new offensive coordinator; Arkansas, new quarterback, new offensive coordinator; Florida, they're back, but Alabama, new coordinator; Kentucky, new quarterback, new coordinator; Mississippi State, new quarterback, new coordinator; Georgia. Let's that doesn't fit the narrative. They're elite. But then Vanderbilt, new quarterback, and I believe they fired their coordinator too. So, I mean, there's a lot of newness there that sets up well for, even if Tennessee's secondary is not great, the schedule lines up in a way to where they may not be getting sliced and diced every week.
Yeah, I think if you asked me to pick, I would say Tennessee probably falls in an upset somewhere, like whether it's at Oklahoma or maybe Alabama beats them. I was waiting for somebody to chime in and say it feels like 98 on air for Tennessee fans. But no, that schedule is really favorable. And if Nico, we've talked about this offseason, if he is as good as the potential and the offense is explosive and they can just do enough defensively to get a couple stops, I mean, that schedule sets up as well as you can ask for your Tennessee fan.
All right, how about Texas, Steven? Can't wait to see them getting in the SEC. And they're popular pick to not only make the college football playoff, but potentially win the SEC in their first season in the conference. What's a question mark though you got for the Longhorns?
A restocked defensive front. And not only with that, I think Texas needs more of a pass rush this year. I mean, they had 24 sacks in 10 Big 12 games last year, but we saw this in the college football playoff. They just couldn't get enough pressure consistently on Michael Penix to disrupt and get him onto the ground and win that game. So I think with Devondre Sweat, Byron Murphy leaving, they're going to have to replace two key guys on the interior. They've got to get more active off the edge. Keep an eye on Anthony Hill, linebacker, kind of edge player who could be a difference maker this season. They also brought in a transfer from Arizona that should be able to play right away too on the interior. But the same thing we talked about with offensive lines. You got to be good on the defensive front. Hard to hide defensive issues. You're going against Georgia. May play, some Georgia again this in the SEC championship. So you got to have that defensive front stocked and ready if you're Texas.
Yeah, it sounds like they're really going to miss those two stars they sent to the NFL in the interior. But I'll go a little bit different, Steven. And I know they've raided the portal too, but I'm looking at the newcomers on offense, how they fit in, because I think this is primed to be a big year. We're talking about best quarterbacks in the SEC potentially. Quinn Ewers, if he can be more consistent, can certainly be that guy. But he's going to need Isaiah Bond, Matthew from Alabama, of course, Amari Niblack, also from Bama, Matthew Golden from Houston, Silas Bolden from Oregon State, and Ryan Wingo, true freshman. I mean, these are a lot of new faces, and they're not going to be solely relying on those players, but we're going to need to see some of them step up and how they, the chemistry there with a Quinn Ewers. I think that's going to be key because I think Quinn Ewers can be great next season. But I've said this a couple times before. I mean, his numbers were impressive last year. I think he could be even better this year, but have the same numbers because there may be a little bit of a, obviously a more difficult schedule and transition around him to where he may go from very, very good to elite, but it may not necessarily match the productions number-wise or be better than what he had last year, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I mean, you look at his numbers, and I know statistics don't tell us the whole story, but you look from 2022 to 2023, he was a lot better, more productive. I thought he just looked more comfortable in this offense. And he's had to battle some injuries too. So both seasons, he hasn't had a chance to get full settled over a whole 13-game stretch. I know they're losing a lot with Xavier Worthy and A.D. Mitchell and Jatavian Sanders, and Matthew Golden, Bond, and Bolden, like you mentioned, those three guys at their past schools have been very good. And, they each within there, I think, could be a playmaker for this offense. So I think Ewers' development is on track. He's in the third year as a starter. The offensive line for Texas brings back 4 starters. Kelvin Banks, I think, is going to be a preseason All-American at left tackle. I really like the way this Texas offense is coming together. And I think their receivers, while they may not be as good as they were last year because they're losing someone like Xavier Worthy, I think this group's going to be just fine over the course of the season.
Right. And I mean, you just look at their away games in conference play, Vanderbilt, Arkansas, and A&M. I mean, that's, whew. I mean, you can't do much better than that. I think that A&M, that's obviously going to be a war. But other than that, I mean, short of Mississippi State on here, I mean, it couldn't be any easier.
Absolutely. And especially that second week of the season when they go to Michigan with all the pieces that Michigan's losing, significant turnover in the coaching staff, both sides of the ball. That's the right time to catch Michigan if you're Texas.
Well, how about Texas A&M, Stephen? A lot of new faces there in College Station. What's the biggest question, concern, what have you about the Aggies?
Yeah, I think there is a very broad kind of discussion about how all the new pieces fit together for Texas A&M, but I've got my eye on one thing that's a combo of two things, and that's the line of scrimmage. This offensive line, I think, they've been injured. I think they underachieved. I don't think Steve Adazio was the best offensive line coach under Jimbo Fisher. New offensive line coach now. They've got, I think 4 starters coming back for this season. They've got the ingredients there to take a big step forward on the offensive line, which is good for Connor Wigman because I think he's due for a breakout year. Growth on the offensive line can only help that. Defensively, they're losing some guys, like Fadil Diggs, Walter Nolan, McKinley Jackson. I mean, they are bringing back Shamar Turner, so the cupboard isn't bare. But that we've talked about line of scrimmage and how important it is. There's an opportunity for the offensive line to get a lot better. And there's an opportunity for, even though the defensive line has some turnover, to still be very solid this year.
Right. And yeah, like you said, I mean, it's kind of obvious to go just all the new faces fitting into new schemes and everything like that. So, I'm especially looking at that defense and how they shape up under Mike Elko with transfers like Nick Scorton, DeRicky Wright, who I thought was great at Vanderbilt, kind of got it under covered because of where he played, unfortunately. Scooby Wright and Jaden Hill from Florida, Des Ricks, Bama, Will Lee, Kansas State. I'll be fascinated to see how all these pieces come together, Stephen. But I think that the storyline I'm going to be watching, and I really like these quarterbacks they had last year. So how do they fit into Colin Klein's system? How does Colin Klein kind of, work with them? And specifically, of course, Connor Wigman, who I think he's the real deal. Very unfortunate that he got injured last year, but had he not gotten injured, maybe we'd have more confidence in him as one of the stars of college football. But I think he's got the ability to show that this season in Colin Klein's offense. Cannot wait to see what he's got working. And the way this schedule lines up too, it's going to be tricky right out the gate, Stephen. Notre Dame in the opener, who I'm seeing some preseason top 10. I don't know anything about Notre Dame, but that's going to be a tricky game. At Florida's first SEC game, week 3, probably going to be expected to win that. But the Swamp that early in the year, that is not easy. And I would probably lean Florida to actually win that game. But I don't know. I mean, but you win these games and all of a sudden you're looking at one heck of a year. You lose them and you're just trying to figure out what are we under Mike Elko.
Mike, I think I'm glad you put that schedule up because as when we talked about Tennessee, I think the same thing can apply here for Texas A&M because we're going to have a ton of time this offseason to dissect like playoff contenders and sleepers. But every time I look at A&M's schedule and I see LSU, Texas, Missouri, Notre Dame, all at home, granted going to Starkville, going to Auburn, going to South Carolina, those are some tricky road trips. But there are some real opportunities here when you're getting, 4 ranked teams at your place. And frankly, that's 4 probably of the top 15 teams in the country. The schedule sets up favorably for A&M to make a run at the college football playoff. So yeah, there is a lot of transition, but there's also opportunity there with the schedule. And especially if you think Connor Wigman breaks out kind of like we do, then A&M's probably a team to buy some stock in.
Right. Let's just take a leap of faith, Stephen. Notre Dame, Mizzou, LSU, Texas, those are the 4 you referenced key home games. If A&M goes 3-1 against those 4, would you be so bold as to say they'll probably make the playoff?
I think so, because I don't see them losing. I mean, I think you'd have to probably lose at least 3 of those other games. I just don't see it. Like, I think if they go 3-1 in those games, I think they're very much a playoff team. And not to mention, I think we'll have to see what the committee values. But if you're telling me that you beat Texas and you beat LSU and you beat Notre Dame and they're all in the top 12 at the end of the year, that should count for something, even if you're sitting there at 10-2 and maybe don't have as good of a record as somebody else.
All right, folks, you heard it there first from Hot Take Steven Lassan. A&M's going to the college football playoff. What's next, Steven? Next year, go say Vanderbilt's going. What's biggest question mark for the Commodores?
I think you could go a lot of different ways with this one. I kind of go, if you're Vanderbilt, can you find a strength and build around it? Clark Lee's a defensive coach. They've ranked last in the SEC in points allowed for 3 consecutive years. He's going to take over the play calling duties this year. They've brought in some guys from the portal. Can they get a defense that's just solid and lean on that? Or is it the offense? Diego Pavia, Tim Beck coming over from New Mexico State. I like that tandem, but you've got offensive line questions. Receivers a big question this year. Is there anything there that you can build into a strength and then lean on it this year to try and take a step forward? So for me, it's this spring is which side of the ball ends up being a strength and then finding ways to lean on that to try to be competitive in the SEC this year.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting, Stephen. We're saying different things, but I think we're saying the same thing. I was going to go find an identity because this.
Yeah.
I know we don't do this in college football, Stephen. This is more of a professional term, but this feels like an expansion franchise.
Yeah.
I think we're so bad, and yet now it's like man. I mean, I'm just like shaking my head at what I mean. People are joking, but it's fair. I mean, is the stadium done yet? No, the stadium won't be done till 2025. The team won't be done till 2035. You know what I mean? Like, and any glimpses of hope they have, just jump in the portal. And it's fascinating, which again, I joked, I called you Hot Take Lassan because you're the furthest thing from a hot taker, yet you're the only one I've heard say, well, if Clark Lee goes winless in the SEC again, he's probably gone, which how can you debate that? Because 3 or 4 years, winless. If that happens, I hope it doesn't, but 3 out of 4 years, you got to win more than that. We got to see improvement. And I thought last year was that big year. He came, he opened camp. He said, "This is our year. This is our year to make a bowl game." And then they were just awful. They were basically as awful as they were the first year. So I don't know what we're doing here, but we need to find an identity, whether it's toughness, whether it's defense, whether it's offense. I don't care. Just find an identity, because sadly going into year 4, I feel like we have no identity in Nashville.
I thought if anything, when Clark Lee was hired, they would have a good defense. Like, it may not be top of the SEC, but they would be tricky every week. They would create some problems, and we haven't seen any of that. And so I think there is a when you look at their schedule, when you look at Clark Lee's record, there is an element of, even if they do go winless in the SEC, if they're more competitive and they're showing sort of signs of life and taking a step forward, I think you could kind of go with that if you're Vanderbilt. But I don't think you can kind of tolerate another 0-8 season where you're just woefully uncompetitive. There's no strength there. There's no progression in the program. By year 4, even at a place like Vanderbilt, we should start to see some signs of progression. And I mean, I'm having a really hard time finding a spot that I would say I feel good about that for Vanderbilt. Don't you agree?
Yeah, this is the one SEC team, Stephen, that should be playing UMass that apparently isn't, because it seems like all the rest are playing UMass. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, they got Alcorn, so I'll give them that. But we need about 10 Alcorns if we're going to make a bowl game here in Nashville.
Not to mention Georgia State now with Jim Chaney on staff, Del McGee, running back coach of Georgia, taking over there at Georgia State. That's an interesting non-conference game. So not going to be easy for Vanderbilt.
How about this? Cousin Shane, he may have said something nicer than we all said. Clark Lee would go bowling if there was no transfer portal. Great coach, but at the wrong time. What do you buy into that at all?
I could buy into that. I think it's hard to build. When Clark Lee took over, he talked about that 10-year plan, and when I heard that, I was kind of like, you don't get 10 years of college football to build, and even more so now because we've seen it. I mean, some coaches, you get 2 years and you're out of there if you don't get signs of progress. And now at a place like Vanderbilt, where you probably have to recruit, develop, and retain, it's harder there than it is elsewhere. So maybe at a different time, I could see that. I think he could be more successful. This is just a really, really hard job in a really, really difficult environment for head coaches.
Yeah. Well, Stephen, We nearly went 90 minutes here. Spring football talk, late February. If y'all watch this, you are a diehard SEC fan, so we cannot thank you enough, each and every one of you, especially those that tuned in for the live show. Before we go, Stephen, can you tell the audience where can they find you and where can they give you a follow on social media?
Yeah, absolutely. You can check out all my work at athlonsports.com. Also do the Cover 2 College Football podcast covering all things college football. You can follow me on Twitter at AthlonSteven. I'm on YouTube, all CFB 365, and Stephen L. CFB on Instagram and Facebook.
All right, Stephen, I appreciate you, buddy. And if you made it this far, please give us a like, subscribe, do all that jazz. Give us a review, and we'll send you a beer koozie just for your trouble. But that's going to do it for this episode of the show. We'll catch you on the next one.